Thank you again for this, opportunity. Today, I don't have any PowerPoint presentation. Something. There's only one map, basically, since we are going to talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative. I thought, we might be keep referring again and again some of those issues which are mentioned here. So, in the next half an hour or so, roughly, I'll try to touch 3 or 4 points. One is that what is really happening today at the connectivity front, because this is one major connectivity project, but this is not the only one. There are so many other things that are also happening. So why this is happening, what is this happening, one has to just look into this. Secondly, what is this China's BRI, before we move into just very basic understanding that how this started, how big this project is, and then looking into how India looks at China's Belt and Road Initiative. But you cannot isolate India's perceptions about China's BRI only about BRI, because it has to be contextualized within the India-China relations. So what is happening, again, I'll try to briefly touch within the broader India-China relations, how India looks into this BRI. At the same time, how China is also expanding into kind of India's traditional area of influence, which is South Asia. And then finally, I'll also come to a point, because now European Union has also come out with its own connectivity strategies. First, Europe-Asia connectivity, and now the global gateway network. And India has also signed connectivity partnership with the European Union. This is a question, can India and European Union can provide some kind of alternatives to the China's BRI? So these are a couple of points I'm going to touch in the next half an hour or so. Now, if you look at current phase of globalization, I think it's becoming quite clear that the next phase of globalization, definitely in the Eurasian or in even the broader scene, I would think, this is going to be defined by geoeconomics and geopolitics of connectivity. This connectivity, of course, is defined very broadly by most of the players. And if you look at today in the emerging Europe, Asia, or Eurasia, whatever, economic architecture, you look at almost every important country in this region has its own kind of plan or strategy of connectivity. Now, this particularly Chinese BRI, of course, has dominated discussions, but at the same time, there are so many other schemes which are also there. If you look at even from the European side, now since 1993, you have this TRASECA project, which is Transport Corridor Europe, Caucasus, Asia. There are about 14 countries which are mainly from the Caucasus and the Central Asian region. So the European Union was also trying to promote transport linkages with these countries. Then, of course, in 2011, United States, at that point of time, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, she announced new Silk Road Strategy project when she was delivering a speech in Chennai, in Delhi, in India. So this whole plan, when United States were very much in Afghanistan, the idea was, how do you really link South Asian economies with the Central Asian economies via Afghanistan? You have all these transport corridors, trade, energy, all those kind of linkages, because there was also broader geopolitical design, that the idea was that Central Asia, which was becoming more of either you have the Russian influence or the Chinese influence was increasing. How do you really move Central Asia away from both Russia and China? But how do you provide new markets for Central Asia? So Central Asia, perhaps South Asia, and within South Asia, India would provide major markets in that sense. So the United States kind of started this project. It was, in fact, in one way, the Chinese BRI is actually, they took those ideas and actually implemented many of those projects here. But that project never really took off because conceptually there was nothing wrong in this, but only thing is that there was very little funding behind this. We can come back to those issues because we are not discussing this. Then you have the Russian design since 2015, whole Eurasian Economic Union, where they were trying to again connect, particularly the whole former Soviet space with the Russian region. And then you have now, so many other plans. The G7 has, they have announced this Build Back Better World, where you kind of, try to create infrastructure partnership for low and middle income countries. Then if you can look into individual countries, now we don't have time, look at South Korea, look at Japan, look at Iran, look at Turkey. Every country has its own connectivity design. If you just go to CSIS Washington websites, they have kind of trying to monitor all these connectivity projects, and yet then you can so look at what is Turkish plan of connectivity, what is South Korean plan. So every country has in that way. So it means what I was saying that now of course in 2018 the European Union announced its own Europe Asia connectivity strategy, which is basically what this the principles of sustainable, comprehensive, and international rule-based connectivity. And now, of course, they have come out further, not just Europe and Asia. Building on this, you have the global gateway strategy. And then in 2019, European Union also signed a connectivity partnership with Japan, and now they have last year they also signed with India. Now, India has its own connectivity. I wouldn't say strategy, but one strategy. But there is a kind of, if you look at carefully, more than 35 strategic partnerships India has signed in the last 10, 12 years, and then about 15 free trade agreement which India has signed. And then all the development activity India is doing, particularly in the neighboring regions and also in Africa. And on the basis of all these activities, whether these are grant projects or you have other capacity building projects or lines of credit, particularly for infrastructure for African countries. So India has its own kind of connectivity projects which are based on different strategies. First you have the Look East policy. Now later on became Act East policy, which is linking, how do you link the Eastern East Asia, Southeast Asian economies with Indian economy. And then you have Connect Central Asia policy, Africa policy. So you put together, and policies within the Indian Ocean region, you put them together and some of the national projects. So it means you can also try to see some kind of Indian strategy of connectivity, particularly linking more within South Asia and with the ASEAN region. And later on also they working with the Japan with the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. So it means, what I was trying to say, that every country has its own. But why we are concentrating more now on China's Belt and Road Initiative? Because this is the one strategy which has kind of dominated discussion in the last 10 years now. And in literature, you will also find that many of the strategies coming out, say, for example, today, either from the G7 countries or from the European Union, many scholars also trying to analyze it as a counter to Chinese BRI, because Chinese BRI has become so big. So now other countries also trying to, bring some kind of parallel connectivity strategies. Now this strategy, as you know, in 2013, this was announced by Chinese President Xi Jinping when he was visiting Kazakhstan. So first he actually announced about Silk Road Economic Belt, which is, the upper portion. This was basically connectivity through Central Asia to Europe. And then subsequently, he also announced sea trade infrastructure road. So this is kind of maritime road which would connect China with Southeast Asia, Europe, and Africa. Now, the major focus for this road was basically building ports, bridges, industry corridors, and other infrastructure within Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Now, together, till 2015, this strategy was kind of labeled as One Belt, One Road, OBOR. And then since 2015, the government kind of definition of this is now Belt and Road Initiative. So initially in the first Belt and Road or OBOR, you had the 6 international corridors which were kind of announced. You have China, West Asia, China, Central Asia, West Asia corridor, number 2. And then you also have a new Eurasia land bridge, which is going up towards Russia. Then you have China, Mongolia, Russia, China, Indochina Peninsula, China, Pakistan Economic Corridor. Then you have Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, BCIM, EC, and then this whole, and then the belt part later. Basically, according to the Chinese government policies, they basically followed 5 priorities, what they say. 1, your policy coordination, which is promotion of intergovernmental cooperation, macro policy exchanges. 2nd, infrastructure connectivity, which is improving connectivity infrastructure and coordination of technical standards. Number 3, unhindered trade, which is basically reducing trade and investment barriers and also promoting regional economic integration. 4th was financial integration, which is basically cooperation and coordination in the monetary policy matters, and also setting up certain financial institutions, and then to have people-to-people contacts. Later, they also added a principle of industrial cooperation into this. Now, in 2017, China organized the first BRI summit, which is about, as per the Chinese government information, about 80 international organizations and about 1,600 representatives from about 140 countries. They participated. And then this forum produced what they said 250 deliverable in 5 areas. And from European countries, in fact, many European countries did participate in that, particularly, I mean, I can go into, but, mainly from the, Southeastern Europe, but also you have, Germany and Hungary, Greece, etc. They also participated. Then you had the second BRI forum in 2019, where again 37 world leaders participated. Now, instead of original 6, these corridors, they changed these numbers. So what you have is there are about 35 economic corridors and projects now, because it's not just economic corridors now, you have economic corridors and projects. So some of the projects were kind of discontinued, like particularly if you look at the BCIM, Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar one, because India had certain objections. I'll come back to this on that corridor, because this was already working even much before the Chinese BRI was announced. So they removed Chinese BCIM, but they had other 2-3 projects, corridor which with Nepal, corridor with Myanmar, etc. And as per the Chinese government statistics, and that second forum itself, about 64 billion worth of kind of deals were announced. Now, today the information latest from the Chinese information is that 173 cooperation agreements with 125 countries and 29 international organizations about BRI has already been signed. So it means for Chinese government, this is a quite big project in which they feel that more than 125 countries are participating. So the initiative, which basically started to cover Asia and Europe, now this has been expanded to Africa, Latin America, and South Pacific. Now, between 2013 and 2018, as per the World Bank estimates, investment in BRI projects was about 575 billion. This is World Bank estimates, of these projects. As per the OECD estimates, The BRI projects are estimated to add about 1 trillion funding between 2017 and 2027. It means if you look at from the Chinese statistics, you look at from the World Bank statistics, other international statistics, so it means numbers may vary, but the question is there are issues, plenty of issues, but large number of countries are participating for various reasons. One can come back for discussion, and many projects are still being implemented, at various stages. Now, so we are looking now at two aspects. What is the Indian perceptions of this Chinese BRI, and can India and EU really can come out with an alternative to this such a huge project? But India, China, as I said, perceptions cannot be looked just in the vacuum, because if you look at India and China, the both are undergoing profound societal transformations. Both are also expected to play an important role in the evolving Asian economic and security architectures. Since both are rising powers in the same part of the world, there are bound to be some tensions. But now the kind of tensions what we are seeing today, particularly since May 2020, the relations today are at the lowest point in recent decades. And this has also coincided with the US-China tensions. So India's difficulties with China has also coincided with the American difficulties with China. So it means, so that's why you can also see a lot of convergence is taking place in Quads and all other discussions there. There are many serious diplomatic, military, and other engagements happening with China, but still situation is quite tense. Last year, Indian Foreign Minister, he was giving a speech somewhere, and then what he said about India-China. He said, I quote, "The India-China relationship today is truly at crossroads. Choices that are made will have profound repercussions, not just for two nations, but for the entire world." And just after that, Indian Army Chief was also speaking somewhere else, and he said, China's rising footprint in India's neighborhood, coupled with countries' attempt to unilaterally alter the status quo along disputed borders, has led to confrontation and mutual distrust. So these two statements, in a sense, kind of sum up, where India's and China's relations are today. One is that India's concerns about Chinese increasing footprints in India's neighborhood, and China's attempt to alter the status quo of the disputed border. So the major challenge today, in fact, for India is also how do you really deal with China? So India is not the only one which is worried about how you really deal with the rising and assertive China. But there's a plenty of things which is written in India about India-China. But if you just summarize this debate, it comes to kind of 4 C's, if you have to kind of summarize India-China relations. And these 4 C's are basically conflict, cooperation, competition, and containment. And all 4 phenomena are actually happening simultaneously. You have conflict, the border tension is already there. There was border clashes in 2020. In fact, 20 Indian soldiers lost life there. Then you also have cooperation. Cooperation is happening. You already have, China is India's, biggest trading partner, more than 100 billion trade between India and China. There was also some extent investment earlier. There was also tourism before pandemic started. About 25,000 Indian students were also studying in China. And at various forums, whether you look at BRICS, whether you look at Russia, India, China forum, you also have SCO. So within those forums, they were also talking about many cooperative elements where they can really work together. Then you have competition, which is basically about energy resources, about minerals, about influence in the neighborhood, in Africa, in connectivity, in Indian Ocean development aid, etc. Then you have containment. Now, the China has also tried to contain China within South Asia, particularly through its very close political and strategic ties with Pakistan. So, as a result, India's footprint in Central Asia has remained relatively limited. Now, all these dynamics over the years basically have reflected through border incidents, increasing trade, competition for influence for mineral resources, etc., and also certain cooperation at those multilateral forums. But two important points of this dynamics. One, in recent decades, both did not allow the border dispute to affect other bilateral engagements. And second, there is at the moment huge asymmetry between India and China. And this is affecting India's independent maneuverings because so despite very good political ties with some of the neighboring countries and also with in Central Asia and its own soft power influence, it's not really very easy for India to match deep Chinese pockets. So this particularly economic asymmetry is kind of a limiting, because if you look today, the balance is not what it was in the early 80s, when both these economies were more or less actually at the same level of development. Today, as a result of 4 or 5 decades of growth in China and its outward orientation, it's roughly about 5 times bigger economy than India's economy. And as a result, like if you look at even the Europe-China trade, the Europe-China trade is 5 times bigger than India-China trade. So, it means, once you have 5 times bigger economies, so obviously other countries also will have, you multiply their relations also with 5 times. So that create, kind of difficulties. But on many forums, as I said, on climate change, on alternative norms of governance, etc., they built, new development bank in BRICS, etc. So they try to kind of, work on that. But coming back to the border issue, one also must understand that India and China are large neighboring countries, about 4,000 kilometers of disputed border. But we also understand that they didn't have a common border until 1950. Because it was only when China occupied Tibet, they become neighbors. Because otherwise Tibet was kind of a buffer state between India and China. So in most of the historical contexts, actually, their contexts were basically mainly through other societies because they were not really bordering states. And in the 19th and 20th century, their contexts were intermediate basically through imperialism. And both also did not figure in each other's security calculations. So when India became independent in 1947 and PRC was established in 1949, they were not really prepared to deal with each other. And in fact, the Indian concept of Pan-Asianism of Indian national leaders, it attracted relatively little attention from China. But still they were talking about some kind of, Asian solidarity, etc. You had a lot of history at that point of time. But then we had 1962 war, which was again at that point of time result of a border dispute. So in the next 25 years after 1962 war, there was actually very little interaction again between India and China. This only started in 1988 when Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited China. So both countries then accepted that till boundary disputes are settled peacefully, let other aspects of relationship develop. So this led to many agreements, particularly on the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement of 1993, many series of other confidence building measures. And then you have how you really deal at the lines of control. So since then there are more than 20 rounds of negotiations on boundary dispute. There was also a lot of incidents of Chinese coming in because since the disputed border, it becomes difficult. Sometimes Chinese forces will come this side and they will claim that Indians have come to the other side. But these incidents basically did not become very serious in a sense, at the national level. Now, in the last 7-8 years, these incidents have grown in numbers. And now, of course, the first time after 75, there has been a loss of 20 soldiers at the border. So it means that's what I'm saying. At this point of time, after 2 years, the last 2 years, things are really at a low point. Why this is happening? Because, as per Indian understanding, China has become more assertive, or as Chinese claim that India has also started building more infrastructure in the border area, so they are reacting. But there is a lack of trust and also lack of suspicion of what other is doing at the border. So the kind of relative peace which was there for a few decades, now it's becoming more and more difficult to kind of maintain that. Then coming to this connectivity part. In fact, India was the only country, a major country, which did not participate in any of the BRI meetings. In fact, even the United States had certain representative there, and the Europeans are also participating in, 7 or 8 even at the head of state or head of government level. So India, officially has never rejected Chinese BRI, but the official narrative is quite negative. The broad consensus kind of seem to have emerged that BRI is primarily a Chinese initiative with clear Chinese objectives. So, like any other infrastructure major strategy or project, this will have geopolitical implications and also developmental implications, because you can't, if you are going to build a port, it can be used for military purposes, it can be used for something else. If you're going to build an airport, it can. So it means you can't really say that if China is building many ports around within South Asia or in the Indian Ocean, so obviously this becomes a security concern for any other country which has certain suspicions about China's activities. And one of the major problem, apart from other things, that the concern is about China-Pakistan economic corridor, because like when we are, even in the case of Ukraine, when we are talking about, say, sanctity of national, what do you say, territorial integrity of and sovereignty of independent states, because the parts of China-Pakistan economic corridor are under what India calls the Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So obviously then this is a question of sovereignty related issues, that the areas which India claims, basically China and Pakistan are building certain economic corridors. This is something like this, if some major investment project or infrastructure project is being built, say in Crimea, how Europeans are going to react to this? You are not going to be, since you have not accepted ever Crimea, how would you kind of support any kind of infrastructure project by World Bank or by any other independent company? So in that sense, India, so this was particular project, they had very serious objections. So they have made very clearly in the parliament speeches, etc., that we have strong objections to this. But beyond that, India actually have not really commented much on other projects. But of course, they were, because these are, of course, they said, other countries are going to build those projects, so it's up to them. But, since these are Chinese projects, Chinese designs, others are going to do it, let them do it. So, we have nothing to do with this. At the same time, they were trying to find how difficult or how, it can create that problem now what is happening in Sri Lanka and others. But if you look at the Indian debates, I followed very closely what is actually being written in India about Chinese BRI. So the debate is more or less uh, focused on the geopolitical aspects of the BRI rather than the developmental aspects of the BRI. And about 50% of Indian debate or discussion is again about China-Pakistan economic corridors rather than many other corridors which are happening, and its strategic implications in the Indian Ocean with all the other projects, what they are doing. And another thing which will also happen, I said that, this second corridor, which one you have, Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor. This is the number 5. This particular corridor, again, India has, I mean, bit of a problem with this because this project was already working for many, many years. In the sense, in discussions were going on. In fact, I remember I was in 1999 in Kunming when this kind of initiative was discussed and first Kunming initiative was announced there. So in 1999 itself, this BCIM corridors were being discussed with 4 countries. The idea was that Southwest China, Northeastern India, Myanmar and Bangladesh will kind of, sub-regional cooperation in these areas will happen. So there were many discussions happened and then it was from second track, 1.5 track and the government started interacting more in 2011-12. So India again objected that this project was already there. So it's not really part of BRI in any way. So why do you really bring it to BRI? So the moment China brought into BRI, India actually, start interacting very little about this project. So it means whatever, development was taking place, even that had actually went down after this. It has become kind of, rather difficult to work on that. So that's why in the second BRI summit, China removed this from the list because it said, but again, the problem was in the second BRI, China added into the list of large projects, what you have, the International North-South Trade Corridor, which is again started long back, in the 90s itself, but in 2004, they had an agreement between India, Russia and Iran. This is again building another corridor from India to going up to Russia via Iran and using Iranian railroad and then going via Caspian or via Azerbaijan going further to Russia. So, so this was again, although India has not really talked much about this, but again, India thought that this project was already there many years back. We were working, so this is nothing to do with really Chinese BRI. So why you are bringing this in? But now the problem was because the Russia is working very closely with the China, so they didn't have any objection to this. Similarly, Iranians also working very closely with China. So since other 2 partners did not raise any objection to this, so India anyway was not participating there. But these are the kind of difficulties India find that, and you can also find, this is, I'm looking from the Indian side, but if you look at many other projects of China, so many things which were already happening at various fronts, you put them together into the large kind of design. But that also happened. I think this is nothing very special about China. This happens actually in any, this kind of large strategy when you are going to announce. Europe will also do the others. Many of the projects which you're already doing, you put them together and make it a grand strategy. So this is what has happened, I think, in this case. So when the China is now actually progressing with this one, now, so it means, as I was saying, that there was a lot of discussions about in India, either some of these projects or the geopolitical aspect of this in the Indian Ocean region. Now, beyond that, I didn't find much of discussion in India about developmental aspects of other projects. Now, what is happening in Central Asia? Whether India can really benefit from some of those projects which China is building, because China is #1 trading partner of all these countries now. So obviously it's going to make much sense from the Chinese side to really invest into those projects. So now India has limited, say for example, economic linkages with Central Asia. But if China is building certain projects in those areas, can you take advantage? Those kind of discussion I don't really find much in India because the government narrative is negative. They're looking more into geopolitics or certain project. Beyond that, there's no major serious discussion I find in India. Then what you have is second major aspect going beyond India. If you look at now the Chinese footprint in South Asia, which traditionally, this was the area which was considered to be an Indian area of influence because of its history, because of its geography, its religion, languages, culture, etc., which favors basically India. Now, China tried to balance this with its close strategic ties with Pakistan. But now, with the Chinese footprint happening in this region, I think Indian position is seriously being challenged. So now Chinese objectives, because initially I think the Chinese strategy in South Asia was basically to maintain a kind of strategic balance. In practical terms, it basically meant checking India's rise by supporting Pakistan in the context of difficult India-Pakistan relations. But in addition to this basic objective now, its interests are now really diversified in South Asian region. Because China's economic rise and liberalization of South Asian economies, now this has provided many new opportunities for China. So, and some of the other challenges which China is also facing of separatist religious extremism in Xinjiang and other regions, this also they find very significant South Asian linkages. So they feel that security and stability of the Afghanistan-Pakistan region is also becoming important even for China. So China also wants to kind of neutralize US strategy of Chinese containment in this region and beyond. But now I think, objectives have become more diverse. So today, if you look at South Asian trade, China's trade has really surpassed India's trade. Even India-China trade, which used to be about just 3-4 billion, now it's 100 billion trade. And it's hugely in favor of China, as happened. So overall, in 2019, China had about 136 billion trade in South Asia, and out of which about 115 billion were just exports. And now you can get into the numbers, country-wise, but then you also, in addition to this trade, the South Asia is also the largest arms export market for China. If you look at the CIPRI data, between 2000 and 2018, 52% of the total Chinese exports went to South Asia, 40% only to Pakistan, and then after that to Bangladesh and also to Sri Lanka. And then beyond this region, then if you look at the Indian Ocean region, there again, I think, China is also expanding into all these areas in the Indian Ocean region. Now, when this is happening, both at the bilateral front and also in the Indian Ocean region, also within South Asia and in the connectivity front. So how India is really responding to this? India is basically trying to now it's sharpened its economic engagements with the United States, and now you look what is happening in the whole Indo-Pacific region. Just day before yesterday, you had all the meetings of the Indo-Pacific regions. It has also strengthened its partnerships with the ASEAN countries. It's actively participating in all these Quad meetings, and so where in fact I was just looking some of the speeches of the Indian Foreign Minister, and he said where our relationship is heading. And he said, I do not have any definite answer at this point of time to offer. And the development of India-China ties, what he said, is based on mutuality of 3 mutuals, which is mutual respect, mutual sensitivity, and mutual interests. And then he had actually 8 points. Then I'll not go into all these 8 points, but he came out with this 8 points that this is what actually basically, we can kind of look into this. But basically, I think the gist of his argument was that all the agreement which has already been signed, particularly about the border areas, that has to be kind of, respected. And then we can just find other opportunities to work with each other. And we must be very sensitive about each other's sensibilities, in this region. So now, if you from this India-China thing and what is happening at the BRI front, now if you look at the European side, now Europe, as I said, in fact, when the Europe announced its Europe-Asia strategy, in fact, many analysts also looked at it as a kind of, answer to the Chinese BRI. Although, in fact, Europe never said, because China, as you can see, Europe is also very deeply engaged economically with China. Both are economic heavyweights. If you look at today India-China trade, this is about $700 billion, both goods and services trade. So it means in practical terms, between China and the European Union, like $2 billion worth of goods and services are being exchanged every day. And if you look at most of the things which were happening between China So their target also was initially Europe through the Chinese BRI, and they really penetrated in the kind of periphery of European Union. Later on, of course, they've also expanded into almost every part, in, going up to Latin America and Africa as well. So when they came out with the this Europe Asia connectivity strategy, so this is basically what they said: the sustainable connectivity, economic, fiscal, environmental, social. Because now there was also a lot of another thing has also happened as for the Chinese BRI is concerned in the last 3 years. Initially, you had two dimensions about developmental aspects or geopolitical aspects of this, but now there is also a lot of discussion. I would find what one can call it, domestic political economy implications of what is happening through Chinese BRI. What is happening in Sri Lanka is very clear-cut example. The country, the economic collapse, and many people actually link or look at Maldives and in other countries that what is happening at the economic front in these countries are also linked to some extent, all those, regimes when they were working very closely with China back in the last 3 years because of pandemic, when difficulties are there in the economy. So all the debt which they have really incurred, they have not been able to repay. It's created a lot of difficulties in economic scene. So now the European Union also start talking about sustainable connectivity, where the countries can sustain itself, and then you also have environmental sustainability and everything else. So they came out with this now not just only Europe Asia connectivity, but the global gateway connectivity also. So as per EU plan, I think they'll be mobilizing about major infrastructure funding up to about $300 billion between 2021 to 2027. And similar to India, as I said, the European Union, if you look at the EU papers on China, so they also talk about cooperative relationship and also competitive and also systemic rival. At the same time, since they are also deeply involved, engaged with each other economically, and in fact, they also signed even investment agreement. Still, it is frozen at the moment in the parliament, but you never know, things may change. So now and they also signed connectivity partnership with China, with Japan, and now they had this connectivity partnership also is in India. So can all these connectivity partnership with India and Japan, and India has also signed another connectivity partnership with Japan, which is Asia Africa Growth Corridor. So it means, can we just put together, and in fact now even in the yesterday at the Indo-Pacific, the Quad summit also, they talked about infrastructure. You look at all the G7 summits, they also talk about infrastructure. So from where I started, that what you can feel now, in the next 10-15 years, major discussion, because we are not talking about now the trade agreements, etc., because many things are already settled and things are other going to be settled soon. And now the major kind of geopolitical competition which is going to be in this connectivity area. And there you will find this already major project is already there, and the numbers I gave you in the beginning. And then others, can they really compete or come with a parallel kind of understanding? And now there are two ways. I'll just conclude with this. There are two ways to look into now all these different connectivity strategies. I've been following this for the last 10-15 years, much before even things become more difficult or complicated now as they are in the connectivity, particularly in the context of BRI. My personal opinion is, these are, I'm talking about what the government really looks into all these connectivity strategies, that ultimately, all these connectivity projects are going to be based on finally successful if they are financially, economically viable projects or not. If they are not, whatever they might talk, whatever the China may think, whatever Europeans may think, or anybody else will think, because ultimately, so long as economically projects are not viable, they are not going to be, huge success. But when China has actually went with these, hundreds of those projects, so you can, if you want to look at negatively Chinese BRI, one can pick up those 10 projects which are not really doing very well. And there are examples you can pick up from Sri Lanka, you can pick up from somewhere else. But then if you want to look at those things negatively, then you are not going to look into many of the positive things which are happening in the Chinese BRI. And then, since, as I said, the geopolitics of different strategic projects are it's like this, that the moment you make it a grand strategy, immediately, the tensions start rising, and other players start trying to kind of cut your projects. I've seen these things happening for the last 10-15 years, and in fact, within that context, I find that the Japanese approach is much more, I would say, mature and sober, because apart from China, you will find two other major projects, which are two other major players, which has also been quite active in the infrastructure sector. One is the European Union, and second is Japan. And Japan, for the last 20-30 years, if you can look at the investment they have made in the infrastructure sector, particularly in East Asia and Southeast Asia, it's quite huge, because this also benefited Japanese economy, the way it linked into those markets. But Japanese approach is never try to make it big. Don't make it a splash, that this is what our design is. Just keep slowly and slowly building your infrastructure project. If you follow that strategy, some projects which are going to be successful, people will look into this, other you can slowly move out from those projects. But the moment you make it big project, I remember when I was working in Afghanistan, when the US strategy was announced, and when you had a Istanbul summit about regional economic cooperation, both Iran and Russia, they were so much against, they didn't want even the word new Silk Road strategy actually in any of the declaration. Although, nothing happened in many of those projects, but this is what happened. When you announce a huge project, suddenly it becomes a geopolitical competition kind of thing. So now, at the moment, what is happening is, it's not just only about Chinese BRI, but everybody is coming out with grand strategies. But grand strategies don't work like this. In the US, they came out first with the new Silk Road strategy. Then you had the Blue Dot network. I don't know where is that network thing now. Then they build back better world. Not inside, but the outside the whole world, in the global scene. So when you keep announcing these plans without following it up, then it becomes just talk, geopolitical talk. But I think the Japanese approach, I find, is much more useful, and many of these projects will become fail. Every project is not going to be successful, and I think at the end it might be useful actually for everyone, that instead of building I would say competitive projects, infrastructure projects, if some of those projects in fact become cooperative, it becomes very useful thing for all of them. Like, say for example, the Chinese are building a port in Gwadar in Pakistan. Now India is building a port in Iran at Chabahar port. Now instead of, it's basically, if you're competing with each other, you're competing for the same trade volumes. But if they start kind of cooperating with each other, perhaps this would be very useful to you. You can build more infrastructure there. But this is what perhaps is not happening at the moment. Now there's so much geopolitical talk, so much geopolitical tension. And the way the tensions have been rising, particularly between United States and China, Chinese BRI obviously has become a large project through which everybody is kind of targeting, which is not really very good, at least for the connectivity part in the long run, because then many of the projects are never going to take off, and others will try to kind of, in some way find fault with so many projects instead of actually trying to refine those projects. Because, if you look at, in fact, the Chinese, I find BRI2 meeting, the declaration, if you look at, it's a huge declaration. So all the concerns which you can look at, whether about environmental sustainability, whether you look at debt sustainability, etc., because all the things are listed even by the Chinese themselves. So it's not something that they are not concerned, because it's their money which is going to be, and they are also very much concerned that if some of these projects become failed project, they are the one who are going to suffer. But anyway, so at the moment where we are, there are tensions, and this project, I think this competition is going to be there at least for the next few years, till the time there is some kind of understanding among the major players. Thank you. This is just a broad thing, but any further thing?